Hello and bonjour mes amis! I'm Peter and here I'm telling you stories about the most interesting European cars of the 80s and 90s. Today we are talking about a flagship Citroen car of the 90s, Citroen XM. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe to my channel to never miss a new video. And if you are already subscribed, thank you so much! Now let's get back to the car. The Citroen XM was produced from 1989 to 2000. In total, 333,000 cars were produced, and 60% of them during the first 3 years of production. 90% of XMs were hatchbacks, but this car had a wagon version too, and 31,000 wagons were produced. In addition to production in Rennes-le-Rennais in Bretagne region of France, several hundreds of XMs were exported to China as kits and manually assembled in Huzhou to avoid high customs duties at importing cars to the Chinese market. The history of the XM started in 1955 with the appearance of the famous Citroen DS, which bravely challenged the ways how a car may be designed and engineered. In addition to a very unusual appearance, the DS had a complicated hydro-pneumatic system combining the suspension, steering and brakes all together. The DS was extremely successful, but time goes on and in 1974 it was replaced by another large car, Citroen CX. This car was also extremely successful with over 1 million units produced, and it also had a lot of crazy features and solutions. The CX was produced until 1991 and was one of the most significant French cars of the 70s and 80s. We will definitely speak about it separately someday in the future. The development of the replacement for the CX started at the beginning of the 80s. The Citroën company was owned by Peugeot from 1976. And Peugeot decided that the new flagship of Citroën should be developed on the same platform as the new flagship car of Peugeot, Peugeot 605. It's interesting that despite sharing the platform itself, both cars did not have that many things in common. They had different designs created by different design studios, Bertone for the XM and Pininfarina for the 605. They had different bodies except the floors and lower parts. They had different suspensions. They even had different engines at first. And actually the Citroen XM was more popular than the Peugeot 605, with 333,000 cars sold versus 254,000 for the 605. Both cars are considered commercial failures for the Peugeot Citroën group, but the Citroën made it a little better. Several design concepts for the new large Citroën were prepared by several internal and external design teams in the middle of the 80s. But finally, the one designed by Italian studio Bertone was chosen. This is a rare case when I don't know who exactly was the lead designer of a car. Different sources attribute the design of the XM to Marc Deschamps or Nunzio Bertone, but I don't see the XM in the list of designs of either of them. If you have reliable information about who was in charge of the design of the XM, please tell me in the comments below. The design itself was very bright, clever and really cool for the end of the 80s. In the lines of the roof, the vertically interrupted rear part and the chisel-like front part you can easily find the impressions of the Citroen DS and CX. But the sharp, straight lines of the body panels were definitely the further development of the simplicity and sharpness of the car design concept of the 80s, conceived by Giorgetto Giugiaro in the 70s. The XM with its huge windows, swift lining, sharp skew angles and stamped side strips going along the whole car looked like a spaceship for its time. Unusual, audacious, breathtaking, impressive. The car was built as a business class executive car and should compete with powerful in all senses German rivals, BMW 5 Series, Audi 100, which I have another video about, and Mercedes-Benz 124, which I also have another video about. Citroën couldn't win in dynamics or handling, but it had a lot of advantages in comfort, equipment and price. The car was very well thought of. The large curved windows provided the driver with an ultimate 360-degree visibility. The XM had 13 windows. If you look at the car, you can easily count 12 of them. But the 13th window you could see if you opened the trunk. It was between the rear passengers and the trunk space. So, the rear passengers, very important business persons, had perfect protections from the cold air, rain and exhaust fumes even when the trunk lid was open. The car had unusual wheel rims with flat surface and a special little door to access the tire inflation stem. The purpose of those rims, besides the futuristic design, was to decrease wind resistance and improve aerodynamics. And this worked very well together with the shape of the body. The drag coefficient of the XM was 0.28 for the 4-cylinder versions and 0.30 for 6-cylinder cars. It was better than for many sports cars of that time, including the Ferrari F40, which I also have a video about. In September of 1991, at the Frankfurt Motor Show, Citroen showed the Wagon version of the XM. It was built obviously on the same platform, but it was longer than the hatchback, 496 cm or 195 inches versus 471 cm or 185 inches for the hatchback. With the size, it was the largest French car ever made by that time, and it was one of the most spacious wagons in Europe in the 90s. There were even longer aftermarket versions of the Wagon with double rear axles used as ambulances, passenger vans or limousines. But most of the cars were sold as hatchbacks, and only 10% of the XMs were wagons, which makes them some kind of a collectible item nowadays. Citroën also explored the possibility of a sedan version of the XM, but only one prototype was made for the French President Jacques Chirac in 1996. So the only sedan cars on this platform that you could really buy was the Peugeot 605. Inside, the car was very spacious, comfortable and, for most of trim levels, stuffed with electronics and equipment. For the first years of production, it had a steering wheel with only one spoke, which was typical Citroen's feature of the 70s and 80s. This steering wheel, except for the basic trim level, had buttons for controlling the stereo system, which was hidden behind a little door on the central console. Those buttons are a common feature now, but in 1989 even premium-level German cars didn't have anything like that. The XM had electric seats, very comfortable by the way, electric windows and electric mirrors. In some trim levels it even had heated seats for the rear passengers. This was an absolute novelty in the comfort. The high trim levels also had an electric-powered adjustment of the central armrest between the driver and the passenger. This was probably an excessive feature, but it was unique and cool. The dashboard was not as futuristic and crazy as in the first CXs, but it still was unusual with several levels of instrumentation in front of the driver. The car had a trip computer that could show the fuel consumption, average speed and outside temperature. And many of the cars had an automatic climate control system and cruise control, an option common for American cars, but still something unusual for Europe in the 80s and 90s. Some of the cars had a little weird immobilizer system. You had to enter a PIN code on a special keyboard before starting the car. This was a Citroen's answer to the increase of car thefts in Europe at that time. But the most interesting feature of the Citroen XM was under the car. That was its hydro-pneumatic system, combining the suspension, steering and brakes together. The XM didn't have any springs or struts in the suspension. Instead, it had multiple spheres, filled with compressed nitrogen and oil divided by flexible separators. Several pumps changed the pressure of the oil in the spheres, and those spheres acted like springs of the suspension. This system first appeared on the Citroen DS, but for the XM it was seriously updated with the introduction of additional intermediary spheres and computers to effectively control the whole system. This allowed the XM to change the height of the suspension and the ground clearance, either automatically or manually by moving a switch on the central console. Also, it allowed compensating for the bumps and potholes of the road, keeping the car absolutely straight and creating an unusual and pleasant effect of a magic carpet. The car was like flying above the road. You cannot get the same comfortable feeling in any other car, and on the straight line that was probably the most comfortable suspension in the whole history of cars. In addition, the brakes and the steering were also connected to the same hydro-pneumatic system. This was one of the first production cars with no mechanical connection between the steering wheel and the wheels. When a driver turned the steering wheel, mechanically it was like switching a valve, and the pressure in the system moved the driving wheels accordingly. The cars with the 6-cylinder engines also could have a special derivé steering system that came from the Citroen CX. In the US it was marketed as speed steering. It changed the force on the steering wheel depending on the speed, allowing more comfortable and safe driving both on the parking lot and on a highway. In addition, it automatically returned the steering wheel to the center position, even if the car was standing. It was very convenient for a parking process. You didn't need to fully turn the steering wheel all the way from one side to another. You can just release it and it will be centered automatically. The same for the braking system. It was connected to the suspension system and used the same valve-like principle of work. As a result, the braking gave an unusual feeling, different from any other car. But it was very effective and safe. Speaking of safety, the hydraulic system was developed very smartly. Even in case of the leakage, it would allow you to safely steer and brake for a relatively long time. The combination of the exterior, interior and mechanical quirks and features allowed the Citroen XM to easily win the title of the European Car of the Year in 1990 and 14 other international awards, leaving the closest competitor, the Mercedes-Benz SL, way behind. In 1994, Citroen updated the XM. The car got new engines, updated suspension with a faster and more reliable computer, and a new steering system. The DRV option was dropped. The dashboard was replaced with a more modern, but more boring one. The famous one-spoke steering wheel was replaced with a four-spoke wheel to accommodate the airbag. Outside, the car got new mirrors, new wheel rims, and the spoiler of a different design on the trunk lid. And the Citroen logo on the front grille was moved to the center, from the driver's side where it was before. By the way, do you know what does this logo mean? No, it's not a Christmas tree. Andrei Citroen, the founder of the company, in 1900 visited the Polish city Lodz, which was the birthplace of his mother, Masha Amelia Kleinman. There he saw a carpenter who developed a very unusual type of gears with a chevron-like fishbone pattern. That pattern made them more effective and less noisy. By different sources, Andrei Citroen either bought the patent from the carpenter very cheaply or simply stole the design of the gears and patented them in France in his own name. Anyway, using his family's money, he built a plant to produce that type of gears, and this became the beginning of the Citroen company. So, the artistic impression of those chevron-like gears, invented by an unnamed Polish carpenter, is still on the logo of Citroen cars. From the beginning, the Citroen XM had 7 options for engines, but they all effectively were derivatives of 3 engines. The first one was a 2-liter 4-cylinder gasoline engine widely used in many Peugeot, Citroen and Fiat cars in the 80s and 90s. It could be combined with a carburetor, a single-point fuel injection or a multi-point fuel injection. As a result, it produced from 108 to 130 horsepower, and the XM with this engine had a top speed from 190 to 205 km or 118 to 127 miles per hour with 0 to 60 miles per hour from 11.5 to 12.4 seconds. The second gasoline engine was a famous 3-liter 6-cylinder V-shaped PRV engine with a 90-degree angle between cylinder blocks. This engine was developed together by Peugeot, Renault and Volvo in the 70s and was installed in a huge range of European cars of the 70s and 80s, including Renault 25, Renault Alpine, Peugeot 504, Peugeot 505, Volvo 260, Volvo 760, DeLorean, and many other cars. In the XM, this engine produced at first 170 horses, giving the car a top speed of 222 km or 138 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 8.9 seconds. In 1990, this engine was updated and received 4 valves per cylinder. The power output of the 24-valve engine was 197 horsepower with a top speed of 235 km or 146 miles per hour with 0 to 60 in 8.6 seconds. Not bad, but a little slow for a premium car in comparison with competitors. The third option was a 2.1-liter 4-cylinder diesel engine, either naturally aspirated or turbocharged. With the naturally aspirated version you would get 82 horsepower, a top speed of 173 km or 107 miles per hour, and 0 to 60 in long 17.6 seconds. The turbo diesel was a little more interesting, with its 110 horses, a top speed of 192 km or 119 miles per hour, and 0 to 60 miles per hour in 12.4 seconds. That was one of the fastest diesel engines by that time, but still it was very slow compared to the gasoline versions. In 1992 and 1994, the 4-cylinder engines were updated, dropping the carbureted and single-point injection options, but introducing a turbocharged version of the same engine. This one could produce 150 horny ponies and a top speed of 222 km or 134 miles per hour with 0 to 60 in still very long 9.3 seconds. Both 6-cylinder options got small updates in 1993, but in 1997 they both were replaced with a new 3-liter engine with a 60-degree angle between the blocks, which the XM shared with many other Citroen, Peugeot and Renault cars. In the XM, this engine produced 191 horses, a top speed of 233 km or 145 miles per hour, and 0 to 60 miles per hour in 8.4 seconds. So it was the most dynamic XM, but it was much slower than the German competitors of the end of the 90s. The diesel engines were also updated in 1994 with the introduction of the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder turbo engine with 127 horses, a top speed of 201 km or 125 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 12.1 seconds. The XM was available with a 5-speed manual and a 4-speed automatic transmission. The manual gearbox had a rather long travel of the gear shifting lever, but the shifting itself was sharp and convenient. After the facelift of 1994, an optional auto-adaptive automatic transmission became available. It assessed the driver's driving style and switched to the most appropriate of the 6 onboard programs, defining the shifting pattern. Also, the transmission had a button for the sport mode, which shortened the gear switching time and changed the RPMs at which the switching took place. For some countries, a very convenient snow mode was also available. It basically did the opposite thing to the sport mode. The car started from the second gear, and the gear switching happened at lower RPMs to avoid skidding and sliding of the wheels. The Citroen XM attracted huge attention from car journalists and customers in the 1989 and 1990. The car looked like a spaceship, was very well stuffed, and had a very interesting price compared to the German competitors. And the sales were blooming for the first 3 years. The Peugeot Citroen Group seriously was going to sell 160,000 of XMs every year, but as we know, it never happened. The sales dropped, and the overall production run of the car was just over 330,000 units in 11 years. Since 1998, Citroen sold only about 30 XMs daily in the whole world. So, what happened? Well, the car had very serious quality issues during the first years of production. The main problem was with the wiring and connectors. The Peugeot management wanted to save money, and they pushed their purchasers to get as much cost savings as possible. I believe that this is a common thing for the French management style. I know what I'm talking about. I used to work as a purchasing director for a large French company, and we were always religiously pushed to get more and more savings from suppliers, often at the cost of the quality of the things we purchased. Well, everything comes at a price, and first XMs had huge problems with broken wires and water in connectors, which in turn caused multiple short circuits. And in the cars stuffed with electric and electronic systems, this caused many troubles. In addition, the first XMs had problems with mechanical components, assembling quality, and had very cheap looking and feeling materials of interior trims, especially plastic of the dashboard. Again, because of the cost savings. The previous Citroen model CX was very much prone to rust, so the XM got a fully galvanized body. It was a blessing, and the body itself had a very good rust resistance. You can still see a lot of cars in good condition. But the pipes of the hydro-pneumatic system and elements of suspension were still made of low quality steel. They had a lot of issues with the rust and cold climate, and the repair costs were really high. And overall maintenance of the car with its very complicated suspension and electric systems was very difficult and expensive. In addition, the first phase cars had issues with handling. We'll talk about this in a moment. Almost all those issues were addressed and remediated in the restyling of the 1994 and in later years. So the cars of 1995 and later years maybe lost a little of Citroen's craziness and charm, but gained a lot of quality and reliability. The wires and connectors were not a problem anymore. The plastic became better, and the assembling quality improved as well. But the reputation of the XM was already ruined, and the XM still was an interesting but very slow and heavy car. So, most of the customers preferred to buy faster German or more reliable Japanese competitors. This finally killed the XM in 2000. Citroen introduced a replacement, Citroen C6 in 1999. But the sales of the C6 actually started only in 2005. And this was an even bigger catastrophe for Citroen. They sold only 23,000 of the C6 during 7 years of its production. But enough about the issues. Let's talk about how this car was driven. And this was unusual, controversial, and interesting. The hydropneumatic suspension of the XM ensured a very pleasant driving experience on the straight line on highways. It absorbed all bumps of the road and kept the car perfectly even and balanced. You could feel like you were flying above the road. But at active driving and cornering, the suspension was too soft, and the body of the car was very prone to leaning in turns, making the driving uncomfortable and simply dangerous. Citroen knew about this issue from the CX model, so for the XM they added additional interim hydropneumatic spheres into the suspension and installed a computer that should mitigate all inequalities in pressure and keep the car upright in the corners, avoiding leaning. The problem was that the computer was too slow. It was the end of the 80s, so the electronics was not ideal. Thus, instead of helping, the computer caused more issues with the handling. This was addressed in 1994, and the later cars have no problems with the suspension and handling in corners, but the handling still wasn't any close to the precision of German and even Japanese rivals. Another thing, the XM was very slow for an executive car of the 90s. It was even slower than its predecessor Citroen CX, because it was much heavier than the CX, while using effectively the same engines. The 3-liter versions were more or less acceptable, but still, none of them made 0 to 60 below 8 seconds. It was okay for a family car, but Citroen tried to compete with Audi, BMW, Mercedes-Benz and Jaguar. So it wasn't a car for an active driver. But it probably was one of the best cars in Europe for long-distance travels and family trips, especially in its Wagon version. And if we combine its unusual look, outstanding engineering solutions, controversial handling and quality, and the importance of that car for the French auto market of the 80s and 90s, we can certainly say that the Citroen XM maybe wasn't a cool or active car, but it definitely was a very interesting, remarkable, and significant one. Peugeot Group tried to sell the Citroen XM in the United States in the 90s, but failed with that. They imported several cars and passed approval processes, making some changes to the cars. For example, the US version had double seat belts, with the top part attached to the door and the lower part with a separate buckle, like in airplanes. But the American price of the car after those changes was too high, and the sales of the XMs in the US were almost non-existent. But most of the XMs are older than 25 years now, so you can legally import them to the United States from Europe. I recommend attentively checking the condition of the car before buying. This was a technically complicated car, difficult to maintain properly. So many of them, unfortunately, were poorly maintained and may have significant defects. And it may be difficult to find parts for a full restoration now, especially for cars before 1995. In Europe you can now buy an XM in a normal working condition for a price from 3 to 10,000 euros. Cars in very good collectible condition are rare, and the asking price may be from 20 to 70,000 euros. But you can find the car for 500 euros as well, if you want a difficult but interesting restoration project. The XMs were very cheap several years ago, but now they are gaining their value because not that many of them remain on the road in good condition. It will be a very good and interesting collectible car in the future. So, if you like it, go for it now. Well, thank you very much for watching. If you owned or drove a Citroen XM, please tell me about your experience. How different it was from other cars, and did you like driving it? And if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. New interesting stories are coming soon. Merci beaucoup, mes amis, and see you next time.